We will now start the team-to-team cross-examination. Each member of each team will ask a question, and a member of the opposing team will answer. We will do that for about 3 rounds until everybody's had the chance to ask and answer a question. And then we will conclude that section and move on to the questioning period for judges. But for now, we will ask the affirmative if they have a question for the negative.
All right, so if cap and trade or a carbon tax is truly able to increase a nation's GDP, why isn't every nation implementing such a plan?
I'll take this. Let's make the distinction real fast. There's a distinction between a carbon tax and a cap and trade solution. What cap and trade does is it places an upper limit on the total level of emissions that a certain region or country can emit, while a carbon tax just places a tax on the amount of carbon emissions are emitted right now. So there's a difference because a cap and trade solution is a little bit more effective. And the reason, and as you said, like, why aren't countries already doing this? They are doing this. You can look at China, who's just passed one, Canada, who's had one, different regions in the United States, such as the Northeast region and the Western region of the United States, and other developing nations who have had cap and trade programs. They realize the benefits, but we need more support, we need more funding, and that's why it's important to prioritize this solution.
And so, building off of that, we'd like to ask you a question. And in your rebuttal speech, you said that because we have 40 years until the tipping point, mitigation is not urgent right now. Why is adaptation urgent if there is still 40 years left, especially because adaptation is often seen as the last-ditch effort?
Okay, well, the reason why it is so important is because there's lives and livelihoods lost right now, and that with these people being currently affected and us, according to you, knowing that there'll be this 40 years, there's no urgency to do it until we get to that 40 years point. Whereas these people are already being affected right now by climate change. So we obviously want to protect them and as well as their livelihoods and environments the best that we can under the current scenario, rather than mitigate for something that will happen 40 years from now, as you indicate.
But I mean,
You
All
can
right,
go
you're
ahead and
gonna
ask a question.
Okay. You write that mitigation can be possible even if not all nations commit to the ideals. If the atmosphere is a global public good that any nation can pollute as much as they possibly want into it, how can mitigation even be achieved if all countries aren't willing to adhere to the idea?
part of that is the countries that are polluting the most are these large economically developed countries like the United States and like China as well. And not all countries have the capability to just first off pollute as well. But also we have these countries implementing these cap and trade solutions and reducing the emissions. And when a country like China reduces their emissions, that has a global impact, impacting every single person out there. And this contrasts with adaptation as well, because adaptation must be implemented in every single country in the world. So therefore, if the United States builds a levee around New York, it does not build a levee or does not protect any other country in the world. And therefore, that means that it creates a sense of social gratification because these developing countries often don't have the capability to pay for these as well.
I'd like to ask a question. In your speech, you say that the loss of coral reef is inevitable and that we should adapt to that. How do we adapt to the loss of coral reefs, which are a big source of livelihood for 500 million people?
The problem is that we can't adapt to it, and that's the real problem. Our evidence indicates that no matter what we do, even if the most aggressive mitigation strategies are put into place, the inevitable destruction of coral reefs is certainly imminent. Remember, back to our Solomon evidence, which actually indicates if we stop all emissions today, it would take 1,000 years for the world to cool. And since our evidence already says that the coral reefs are committed to extinction, not even the most aggressive mitigative strategy would be able to bring them back from death.
So wait, if you can clarify for this, you're saying that Susan Solomon is advocating that we are essentially doomed because we have 1,000 years of emissions in the back, and therefore there's no way possible to mitigate at all. You're saying mitigation is completely ineffective.
We're not saying that at all. Remember that the affirmative team is bimodal in its approach, but since the climate has a natural leg in the system where the carbon is emitted and then 40 years later we feel the effects, the world should adapt now to the consequences. Furthermore, if we have 40 years to mitigate, as you guys have already said, there is absolutely no reason that mitigation is an urgent prospect. And because of this, we see that adaptation is the only thing because it's hurting the lives and livelihoods of individuals now.
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
Okay. even if we accept the assumption that mitigation can be urgently implemented, can it achieve its aims in an immediate and practical manner?
Yes. Mitigation, well, the question you're asking is, does mitigation meet the framework of urgent? And the answer is most definitely it does. First of all, we have to look at what urgent is. While you define it as immediate and practical, you ignored the definition that we provided. And when we look at urgent, we have to look at what is best for the human race and for the Earth. What is best for the human race and for the Earth is not the solution that works for the next 10, 15, 20, even the next 100 years. It's what actually allows the Earth to continue surviving. And the only solution that does that is mitigation, because it responds to the root cause, as we talk about, carbon emissions. Now, dealing with immediacy and practicality, we agree with you that any solution has to be bimodal. It has to include some aspects of adaptation and some of mitigation. But when you look at mitigation, mitigation is the solution that ensures sustainability. Adaptation is the solution that deals with the current impacts. It deals with the smaller impacts happening right now, because climate change is not kicked up into full effect. When it does, then full adaptation would be necessary, but it's not going to, because the implementation of mitigation will guarantee the sustainability of the Earth.
And finally, a question from the negative to the affirmative.
So you guys argue in your constructive that big lifestyle changes are unpopular. Empirically, we've seen that efforts to relocate citizens away from coasts have been implemented as a solution of adaptation. Why does this not demonstrate that adaptation is unpopular?
All right, so I think what you're hinting at is the migration point that we brought up from Christian Aid that says that by 2050 there's going to be quite like 1 billion people that have to be migrated.
No, that's not what I was bringing up. I was saying that relocation has been a part of adaptation strategy, like moving people away from coast, not because. And so, like, how as a solution of adaptation, why is that not unpopular? Because it seems like a big lifestyle change.
Right, so they'll have to relocate other regions and they'll have to migrate because of the rising sea levels. And the reason that that's like not as large of a deal is because adaptation will actually be able to respond to those people migrating and to moving away from the sea levels, because it's going to be a lot more practical than mitigation, which doesn't address any of those impacts at all.
Thank you very much.